was working at a conference in Singapore. A British delegate introduced himself to a group of Asian business leaders and said, "I'm from Britain, so I'm sure you all know about our economy and innovation." One of the executives politely said, "Not particularly, no." The British man looked stunned and said, "Really? Britain is a major world power." The executive said, "Singapore does more trade with China and ASEAN countries. Britain isn't really on our radar." The British delegate spent the rest of the event trying to convince people that Britain mattered, listing historical achievements. Everyone nodded politely, but clearly didn't care. He later complained that Asian business leaders didn't appreciate Britain's global significance. It genuinely shocked him that Britain wasn't central to their world. I work at a university in Brazil. A British exchange student asked why there were no British history courses offered. I told him we focus on Latin American and Portuguese history. He said, "But British history is world history. Everyone should learn it." I explained that Brazil has its own rich history. He said, "Yeah, but Britain shaped the modern world. Shouldn't that be mandatory?" His Brazilian classmates laughed and said Brazil's history was more relevant to them. He looked offended and said, "You're all missing out. British history explains how the world works." They told him Britain was just another European country to them. He spent his entire exchange baffled that Brazilians didn't consider British history essential knowledge. I was a tour guide in Japan. A British tourist asked why there weren't more references to Britain in Tokyo's museums. I told him Japan's museums focus on Japanese and Asian history. He said, "But Britain had global influence. Surely that's worth mentioning." I explained that British influence in Japan was minimal compared to China and America. He looked shocked and said, "That can't be right. Britain was everywhere." I showed him the historical timeline exhibits focusing on Japanese-Chinese relations and American post-war influence. He said, "What about trade? Britain must have been important." I told him Japan's main trading partners are China, America, and other Asian nations. He left genuinely upset that Japan didn't acknowledge Britain's importance. I work at a bookstore in Argentina. A British customer asked where the English literature section was. I showed him. He looked at the small shelf and said, "Is this it? Where's the rest?" I told him that's all we stock. He said, "But English literature is the most important in the world. Shakespeare, Dickens, Austen. You should have shelves dedicated to them." I explained that Spanish and Latin American literature dominates our sales. He said, "That's a shame. People here are missing out on proper literature." I told him Borges, Garcia Marquez, and other Latin American writers are incredibly important. He waved his hand and said, "Yeah, but they're not Shakespeare." He couldn't accept that English literature wasn't universally prioritized. I was working at a hotel in South Korea. A British guest complained that BBC wasn't available on the TV. I told him we have Korean channels, CNN, and some Asian networks. He said, "But BBC is the most trusted news source in the world. How do people here stay informed?" I explained that Koreans watch Korean news. He said, "But for international news, everyone watches BBC, don't they?" I told him many countries have their own reputable news services. He said, "I find that hard to believe. BBC sets the standard." His wife said, "We assumed BBC would be everywhere. It's disappointing that Korea doesn't value quality journalism." They spent the week watching CNN reluctantly and complaining it wasn't as good as BBC. I work at a government office in Canada. A British immigrant came in and seemed surprised by the paperwork required. He said, "I thought Commonwealth countries had special arrangements. Shouldn't this be easier for British citizens?" I told him everyone follows the same immigration process. He said, "But we're Commonwealth. We have historical ties. That should count for something." I explained that Commonwealth membership doesn't grant immigration privileges. He got frustrated and said, "What's the point of the Commonwealth then? Canada should prioritise British immigrants." His wife said, "We assumed we'd be welcomed with open arms. It's like you've forgotten where you came from." They couldn't grasp that Canada treats all immigrants equally, regardless of British connections. I was a waiter at a restaurant in Thailand. A British man asked if we had English menus. I gave him one. He looked at it and said, "These prices are quite high. Do you offer discounts for native English speakers?" I told him no. He said, "But English is the international language. We're helping your tourism industry by being here." His wife said, "In countries that rely on British tourists, we usually get better treatment." I explained that Thailand gets tourists from all over the world. He said, "Yes, but British tourists are the most valuable. We spend money and we're polite." I told him all tourists are valued equally. He looked disappointed and said, "That's not very strategic. Britain made English global. You should show appreciation." I work at a museum in Mexico. A British tourist was looking at exhibits about Mexican independence. He said to his companion, "It's interesting they don't mention Britain at all." His friend said, "Well, they were fighting Spain, not Britain." He said, "Yeah, but Britain was the dominant power at the time. Surely we had some influence." I overheard and explained that Britain had minimal involvement in Mexican independence. He said, "That seems unlikely. Britain was involved everywhere in that era." I told him Mexican history is complex and Britain wasn't central to it. He said, "I'll have to Google this. It doesn't sound right." He genuinely couldn't believe a major historical event occurred without British involvement. I was working at a sports bar in Australia. A British man came in during the Rugby World Cup and said, "So, who are you lot supporting?" "England, obviously." The Australian patrons laughed and said they were supporting Australia. He said, "Yeah, but if Australia's out, you'd support England, right? Commonwealth and all that." They said, "Absolutely not." He looked confused and said, "But we're all connected. British rugby is the best." One Australian said, "Mate, we beat you lot regularly. We don't need to support England." The British man said, "That's a bit ungrateful. British sport taught you how to play." They told him Australia has its own sporting identity. He left muttering that Australians had forgotten their roots. I work at a tech company in India. A British consultant joined our team and said during introductions, "I'm excited to bring British expertise to help modernise your operation." My Indian colleagues looked at each other, confused. One said, "We're already quite modern. We have clients in 50 countries. The British consultant said, "Yes, but British business practices are the gold standard. I can help streamline things." My boss, an Indian woman with an MBA from IIT, said, "We appreciate your input, but we're doing fine." He spent weeks trying to implement British efficiency methods that we'd already surpassed. He couldn't accept that an Indian tech company didn't need British guidance to succeed. I was a flight attendant on a route from London to New Zealand. A British passenger asked me, "Do New Zealanders still feel connected to Britain?" I told him New Zealand has its own strong identity. He said, "But the Queen is on their money. They must still feel British." I explained that New Zealand is increasingly independent in its identity. He said, "That's sad. The Commonwealth is falling apart. Don't they appreciate what Britain gave them?" I told him New Zealanders are proud of their own culture and achievements. He said, "Yes, but it's all built on British foundations. They should remember that." His wife said, "It's like the whole Commonwealth is turning its back on us." They seemed genuinely hurt that former colonies had moved on. I work at a film festival in France. A British filmmaker was shocked his film wasn't selected. He said, "But it's a British production. Don't you prioritise English language films?" I told him we select based on quality, regardless of origin. He said, "But British cinema is world-renowned. We invented modern filmmaking." I explained that French cinema has its own prestigious history. He said, "Yeah, but Hollywood and British films dominate globally. French films are niche." The programmer told him French cinema is highly respected worldwide. He said not as much as British films, though. He couldn't accept that his nationality didn't give him an advantage. He left saying the festival was biased against British filmmakers. I was working at a trade show in Dubai. A British exhibitor seemed surprised by the lack of attention. He said, "We're from Britain. Why isn't anyone stopping by?" I told him there were companies from 40 countries exhibiting. He said, "Yes, but British products are synonymous with quality. People should be interested." His colleague said, "In other markets, being British gives us an edge. Why not here?" I explained that Dubai is a global hub where British origin doesn't carry special weight. He said, "That's short-sighted. British engineering and design are world-class." They spent the show wondering why attendees were more interested in Korean, German and Chinese exhibitors than their British company. I work at a publishing house in South Africa. A British author submitted a manuscript and in his cover letter wrote, "As a British writer, I bring international credibility to your catalogue." My editor read it and said, "That's a bit presumptuous. We publish many acclaimed South African authors." When we rejected his manuscript, he replied saying, "You're missing an opportunity to have a British voice in your collection. That would elevate your status." My editor responded that South African literature is internationally acclaimed and doesn't need British validation. He wrote back saying we were being defensive and that British literature is objectively superior. He couldn't comprehend that a South African publisher wasn't desperate for British authors. I was a receptionist at a dental clinic in Malaysia. A British patient asked if the dentist was trained in Britain. I told him she was trained in Malaysia and Australia. He said, "I'd prefer a British trained dentist. British medical education is the best." I told him our dentist is excellent with international qualifications. He said, "Yeah, but Britain has the highest standards. Can you recommend someone trained there?" I told him we don't have British trained dentists on staff. He reluctantly accepted treatment and afterwards seemed surprised by the quality. He said, "Well, she was actually quite good. I expected it to be more developing world." He'd assumed non-British training was inferior by default. If you've enjoyed British people discovering they're not the centre of the universe, give it a like and subscribe for more. Cheers.